Hello again and welcome to another one of our ITS UK coronavirus webinars where we discuss the impacts of the crisis on the transport system and specifically what intelligent transport systems can do to try and help us as we move forward. Don't forget, first of all, that you should really, if you can, subscribe to our YouTube channel to pick up all the great content that ITS UK is producing, not just these coronavirus webinars, but also the various other forum group meetings that we now have as webinars rather than physical meetings at the moment. You'll find some really interesting content on our YouTube page, so do please subscribe. So as always, we have three experts to talk us through some of the issues today. And today we're concentrating on local authorities. So I'd like to welcome Liz Burr, who is Traffic Manager at Essex Highways, Llewellyn Morgan, who is Head of Innovation at Oxfordshire County Council, and Darren Capes, who is ITS Policy Lead at the Department for Transport, but for a long time worked at the City of York Council. So has kind of two views to give us in today's discussion. So what I want to think about today isn't necessarily solutions, but some of the issues that local authorities probably need to be considering now as they're facing changes to the way transport works. For years, we've been talking about getting people out of their cars into public transport, into shared mobility. Suddenly, all that's changed. How do we cope with that? How do we cope with a drop in fares, changes to parking revenue, park and ride, things like that? We want to get an idea of some of the issues that we're facing and then think about how we could use technology and other solutions to move our way forward. So first of all, let's go to Liz. Liz, how's Essex Highways been getting along since all this changed? Because you've got a very interesting county with a couple of main roads flowing through it and then lots of individual towns and a city and the commuting into London. So it's must have been quite a challenge.
Yeah, it has been a real challenge, but I think a real challenge on different levels. So if I just think about us and the work that we do and the service we deliver, obviously we've had the challenges around looking at our own work and what work we can do safely, how we can do that to try and continue business as normal. Because I think what we're aware of within the highway sector, of course, is that if we stop and put a lot of these schemes on hold, actually, after a few months, we're going to need to re-pick up those schemes and it's going to be difficult. So we've looked at trying to continue business as normal as far as we can. But obviously, as you say, Paul, there's been loads and loads of challenges for us, particularly around that public transport, sustainable travel. And I think that's a key area that we're trying to sort of tackle at the moment. So we're certainly starting to look at the idea of reallocating road space. And in reallocating road space for cycling and walking, it's given us some really interesting challenges around technology, because for a long time we've been looking at things like pedestrian crossings and traffic signals and how we actually make those really responsive to the traffic and the dynamic flows. And suddenly we're looking at, well, we haven't really got dynamic flows of traffic. How do we make those crossings or those facilities more responsive to the general public who are walking along? And of course, a lot of our technology has relied on the public, for instance, pressing a button when they get to a crossing. We're thinking at the moment about, can we actually do away with the need for a pedestrian to press the button? Can we make those crossings more dynamic so that we don't get crowding around the footways? So it's almost unpicking some of that technology that we've put in and rethinking it. You know, we've made things very dynamic to traffic. Motor traffic, I should say. And now we maybe need to make it a bit more dynamic and responsive to pedestrians, but in a very pedestrian friendly way or a cyclist friendly way. So they don't need to put a call into a signal timing stage plan, anything like that. So some really interesting challenges there. I think the biggest challenge for us maybe moving forward will be around communications. And I say that because we were at that point of a really big shift towards the use of sustainable travel. So the use of buses, the use of walking and cycling. And with the latest information that came out, obviously, from the Prime Minister the other Sunday, it was very clear that, you know, the preference should be, and I think in his speech he actually did say car first and then cycling and walking, and passenger transport last of all. And I think it's how do we start to communicate to people that our passenger transport services can be operated in a safe and sustainable way so that we can get that shift back, because the last thing we want in a way is a shift back towards the private car. We've seen tremendous benefits in terms of air quality and things like that, and we don't use those benefits. So I think there is a real challenge for us moving forward.
Llewellyn, Oxford itself has a not anti-car, but very much pro-public transport, park and ride mentality, you know, to actually get in from, when I used to have to go to Oxford occasionally when I had an office there, and I would drive from the Headington roundabout into the city centre, you kind of almost spiralled into a car park near to your county headquarters. It wasn't an easy journey by car. It was far easier to park up and take one of the park and rides. Now, of course, that's changed. It must be a challenge for you with somebody who's been trying so much to stop people driving into the city to suddenly handle them coming in.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big challenge for us. We're still going through what the strategy will look like, to be honest, but we're working really closely with the operators to see how they can operate effectively, even though they're going to have to run at a much lower capacity. We're also looking at potentially testing a new app-driven technology that sort of gives you a token to access public transport. So it would give priority towards the key workers. So that's something we're looking at. It's been sort of trialed on rail, and we're going to see if we can get it to work on buses, but we're quite a bit away off that. Our approach essentially has been to divert towards cycling and walking. We're not going to encourage cars in. If anything, we're going to take more car parking out of the city centre and potentially look at reusing the space. So maybe not in the next couple of weeks or even a month or so, but if you look a bit further on, we think the reuse of space where the car parks are might be really important for cafes and restaurants in terms of allowing them to operate. We know there's a preference for them to operate outside because the transmission is theoretically less, and it gives them some more space to have 2 meters people apart. So those are sort of things we're looking at. What we're looking at the moment is prioritising routes for cyclists. So we're even looking at turning corridors into one-way routes. We'd potentially reuse the bus lanes for the cyclists and essentially use a lane for the bus. That also is linked to roadwork. So we're trying to, as Liz was saying, we're trying to get through roadworks as quick as we can. Maintenance, we've done more maintenance than we've ever done, I think, in a small period of time, because we know you've got to fill the potholes where the cyclists are cycling, because it's one of the biggest problems. And also, if we look at the one-way system, it allows us to manage some of the works that we've got booked in for the next few months. We don't want to delay it, but if we look at some of these more radical approaches, it allows us to get more cycling capacity, keep the buses running, and manage the roadwork. So that's what we're looking at doing. We've got tentative support, I'd say, from our members. The one thing we are looking at in terms of ITS is we're lucky we've got quite a lot of sensors that we've got smart sensors that we've put in to count cyclists and walkers, because we knew we had really poor data on that. And that's coming into their own now, because our team spent the last 3 years trying to get good cycling data, and thankfully, because we've done that, we do have good cycling data just about in time, and people are turning around and going, have we got any? And it's like, yes, we've got actually quite a lot. So we're going to look at also using that to identify where we do things and what we do. So I think some of this is just going to be iterative. You're going to have to try it and see if it works.
I think it's interesting, so many of the things you've picked up, including the sharing of the information you have that some of your colleagues didn't even know that you did have, is something that's quite clear. Not only are local authorities sharing information between themselves and the Department for Transport, but it's clear that they're going to have to share it internally so people understand what's happening with travel. But one of the interesting things is that we have very low traffic levels during the stay-at-home stage. So actually coping with people not using public transport and using the car has been almost survivable because of the low traffic volumes. But as people start to go back to work, and they need to, you mentioned the pubs and restaurants, hospitality industry, all those things, that if the economy is going to pick up and not crash and burn for a long time, this part of the economy, which is so important in terms of jobs and livelihoods, will have to come back. We're going to have to balance the fact that more people will be traveling, but you're going to have to find more space for, as you say, things like pubs and restaurants to be outside. So another thing I want to ask is about revenues, because how can you support park and ride? And both you and Liz have very active park and ride schemes in different parts of your counties, especially around Oxford. How are you going to cope with the revenues for that? How are you going to cope if you close car parks with the lack of parking revenue? You know, that must be an issue of having to almost rewrite all of your budgets.
So it's a really big issue for the city council, because the city council do have a big budget gap without car parking. We only run 2 out of the 5 parking, well, we jointly run it now with the city council as well. So it would be an issue, but not as big an issue, to be honest, as social care. So it pales into insignificance compared to those costs. But it is a big issue for the city council. We're working really closely with them to work out how they can also plug some of the gaps in their finance. But I think it's one of the things we've just got to do this. There's a big, much more fundamental debate that this will spark in terms of this is really showing that district and borough council level councils actually don't have very much money from the state. They are essentially companies. So if you look at the city council, I think 80% of their staff's been furloughed because they're companies. So there's this a bigger debate. Do we want our councils to run as companies because we've been forced to run them as companies under austerity? And therefore, when something like this happens, it's very hard for them to change their business model because the income's reduced. So you do risk them essentially going bust like a company. Or do you want them to actually be a council and serve a community, which involves more tax essentially and a different way of funding them? So this is raising bigger debates than I think that we're just going to have to manage it. And we'll work really closely with the city council to do it as best we can. I don't think we can plug the gaps in terms of funding for the parking because it's so big. And that's a bigger debate that has to go up to government to decide how we want public sector to look after this.
Darren, let me bring you in, and I want you first of all to think of yourself from your time at York. Almost, what has gone through your head thinking, well, thank goodness I'm not still at York, because it would have been a nightmare because of X, Y, and Z. What things are you thinking of that your successors will have to be considering when it comes to all the aspects of transport that are now affected by us basically throwing away everything that we did and starting again?
I think I'd like to support the comments previously made. I think all those comments apply to York. I think, in common with a lot of UK cities, there just isn't enough space in York to do the things we now need to do. So we simply can't reallocate road space to cycling, because that means we don't have nowhere to put the buses. We can't put the buses in the traffic lane because there's just not enough space for that. So there are some real, even within the framework of what we've been asked to do by government, there are some real choices to make about how we allocate very limited road space. And I think, as Wellington said as well, what the city will be finding, as most cities have, is a lot of pressure from bodies such as the Business Improvement District, who are desperate to get the city centre working again. The elected members, York, like a number of cities, has quite a strong green contingent on the council. So there's a lot of desire to really make radical change now and to really cement that into the way the city works, because this is our maybe once in a generation opportunity to do that. So there's some real pressures and there's some real decisions to make. Some real thinking around the hierarchy of how we do this. I think there is also the issue of revenue as well, and I think it's important that we really think about that. Most services around transport in York and most cities now are either supported by income from service delivery, and that's normally parking or park and ride, or they're supported by capital, which is basically taking money from the money you get to build schemes. So while that part is probably secure, the part that's supported by revenue most certainly isn't. And yes, you know, York has a parking service that supports a lot of services the council provides, but that's primarily based on leisure parking. We don't really encourage commuter parking in the city centre, because why in the previous policy regime, why would we? So do we? So that obviously won't come back. We won't see leisure parking coming back. Now, do we reallocate that parking for office workers? Do we make it cheaper so it's more affordable? Do we use that parking for something else? Do we need to continue to suppress office use of parking demand in the city because that keeps commuting down, and then take the revenue hit? And the same with public transport. What do we do with park and ride? Now, park and ride in York, as in many cities, is very successful and very profitable. It works on a revenue sharing scheme between the franchisee, the bus company, and the county and the city rather. That's going to change. That financial model, just as it has with the railways and buses naturally and nationally, that will change. That money won't be there anymore. We have some really serious things to consider around how that works. But we kind of need to wait for that to work out. We need to wait for government to decide how funding for local authorities moves forward. In the short term, the issues really are around how we allocate limited road space, how we ensure social distancing, how we ensure that once we are able to start the city centre economy and start the very vital nighttime economy that York has, for example, we can accommodate that safely. I think one of the assumptions in York is that traffic levels will increase, but they're unlikely to increase to levels that we had previously, because we hope, if people follow the government guidance, that a large majority of York's office workers will continue to work at home, and that's exactly what we want to do. So although we expect to see motor traffic rise, we are hopeful it won't rise to the levels it was, and we're hoping that the transfer from public transport to private transport, as suggested by the Prime Minister last week, won't offset the massive reduction we've seen by the increase in home working. So we're kind of hoping on a number of fronts. And of course, the City Council and its other public sector partners, as probably the largest group of employees in the city, have a very important part to play in that, in ensuring that we keep as many staff at home, and ensuring that we continue to support home working, and we continue to support people not travelling into the city centre for work unless it's absolutely necessary.
It's very interesting what you said there, because I think there are two parts of what we're going through at the moment, remembering that we're only really 2 months into this. It seems like a lifetime, but it is only a few weeks. Some things will change as science and understanding comes through, and as we do more testing and so forth. So just imagine that suddenly doctors realise that social distancing isn't actually as vital as we thought it is, and so therefore the need for keeping 2 meters apart, and therefore huge drops in capacity on public transport aren't quite as important as we believe they are now. Just imagine that's the case. That's something that means that any of the decisions we make, we can't think long term, because the science might change, the advice might change in all manner of ways. But there are other things, as you touched on there, Darren, that I think are here to stay. Home working, the idea of going into an office from 9 to 5:30, 5 days a week, for those that are office based rather than, say, in factories or places where you do need to travel to work, that's going to change. People will now surely only go in a couple of days a week, so that's going to change the amount of capacity needed on the trains. It's going to change the fares, revenue, etc. So there's the balance between the short term and the long term, which must even make it harder for the three of you to be making your decisions.
Yes, I think the guidance we have now is obviously guidance written in a time of crisis, and the guidance is there to get us through a very particular problem that we think we understand, and we think we understand how to deal with, and the guidance is very much around accommodating that. I think we have to disassemble that in the long term and think that some parts of the guidance are good, that we will want to continue with, and some parts are very much about dealing with the current crisis. So, for example, I do hope that within a reasonable time frame we can get back to encouraging people to use public transport where possible. And I, for one, never expected to see a Secretary of State stand up in the House of Commons and suggest that people should drive to work. Now, I think we have to accept that that is very much a response to a pressing crisis, and I hope we can wind back from that guidance very quickly. I think other messages around increased use of increased use of cycling and walking, and increased acceptance among the public of why we need to reallocate precious road space in city centres to accommodate cycling and walking. I hope that stays. I hope that's something that we can cement into the way that we do things in the future. Same with home working. I hope we can see an increase in home working. I hope in the long term that what that means is that we can get away from the very, very peaky traffic flows that we have to deal with in cities at the moment. Where most of our systems are configured, and most of our expenditure is configured around accommodating a 1 hour peaking traffic in the morning peak, and we build infrastructure to deal with that. I hope we can get away from that. I hope if we can flatten those curves out by less use of car travel to get to work, by more intelligent home working, maybe we can be a bit more sensible in the way that we plan infrastructure and the way that we accommodate traffic.
And Liz, I've seen you nodding very much there. It seems that the need for technology to be used at the moment, because that can be changed and updated far more quickly than obviously if you put a new rail line in, or you reconfigure all the buses, or you build a new road. That's a long-term solution, but technology can be a short-term solution. So I guess this is where ITS comes in, almost on the white horse over the hill to help us out.
Yeah, I think, yes, but I think moving forward, it's different sorts of ITS technology, it's different sorts of information. I think I'd go back, Paul, to one of the comments that you made earlier about data and information, and I think that has been a really strong thing in this current situation of, as you said earlier, people suddenly realising that we have technology, that we have information, and we have data, and that being then vital in how we can move forward and reshape our town centres. And I think potentially we're looking at technology more around how we communicate, and more technology around monitoring things like air quality as being a real strong thing. I think also how we give priority to different sorts of traffic levels and different sorts of vehicles will be good. And our move has been, as I said earlier, around potentially historically, certainly around helping car traffic, and I think maybe we will see that switch. I'd echo what Darren says. I think the current guidance really is in response to a crisis, and yes, it's frustrating a little bit that maybe the emphasis is on car travel rather than other forms of travel, but I think just from looking at and walking around my own environment, I'm starting to look at my environment differently and starting to think about, well, how could we make this different? So how could we make a town centre different? So we are looking at things like narrowing the highway so that we have less car travel through there. And at the moment, we're looking at doing that with a very much what I'd call the streetworks approach of let's put up barriers and cones and let's put up signs. But actually moving forward, it could be more about planters. It could be more around having that softer environment that actually just makes things feel nicer and has a better environment. So I would hope that coming out of this, we get that better environment and that greener environment. But technology's definitely got a role to play. But I think there are some challenges for us in understanding the technology. And maybe in the short term, as we start to move through from car use to passenger use, again, maybe it's going to be around those apps and that communication that says to users before they plan their journey, this is the best way to make your journey today. If you make your journey on bicycle, or if you make your journey in this way, you're going to be quicker, you're going to be greener, you're going to have less emissions, less carbon, you're actually going to be healthier. Let's try and have an app that also turns that into calorie count and tells me, yes, I had an Indian takeaway last night, so if I ride my bike to work today, I can burn off that Indian takeaway. That'd be really good if I could. But maybe we can think a bit more innovatively about how we package that whole thing to the public. And I think talking about park and ride as well, something we want to explore in Essex and are exploring in Essex is not only park and ride, but could it be park and cycle, park and walk? Can you use those sort of facilities in a different way to encourage your cars not to go back into the town centre, but to encourage the cars to stay more on the outskirts, and then to allow people to have safe walking or cycling routes from a park and ride centre. So I think, technology for me, particularly, I think around the communication and around better ways to sell the message to the public, the benefits of using our sustainable modes of transport. Let's really try and look at how we can do that. And to do that, we need that data. We need the journey time data. We need the air quality data. We need all of that sort of coming together to really sell that message to the public.
And Darren, it was interesting when ITS UK supported you with your Department for Transport hat on now, when we were looking at the data that you needed from local authorities across the country to monitor transport use, how a lot of local authorities actually didn't even realise the data that they had. And some of them have UTMC solutions that have an API that will output their data, and they didn't even know that was a feature within the software. So I guess the first thing that everyone needs to do is actually almost audit what they already have and how best to use it before they go out and start sourcing anything else.
Yeah, so how many of us have bought a new device, a new car, a new laptop, and used every single function it has the moment we buy it? Well, none of us. We do what we want to do with it. We do what it needs to do. And authorities have been doing that with UTMC systems, with data, with services and systems they've been buying from the market. They use what they need to use, and it's only at times like this when we suddenly realise what additional capacity we have. And this has been very clear with the data collection, which has been fantastic. I mean, I have to say that the response of local authorities to our request for data has been fantastic. We have had over 50 responses that we're now using. But again, that to me tells me two things. Firstly, it tells me nobody uses every feature of everything they buy immediately, but an event like this makes you do that. And secondly, it tells me that government's thinking is changing, and government is becoming maybe less introspective, and we're maybe starting to understand more about the data and information we could consume from local authorities, which, to be quite frank, we didn't do a lot of before. And that I think has opened government's eyes to what is out there, what a great tool is out there in terms of local authority data across all modes as a national policy tool. And just to move on to that, we talk about, and thinking about with my York hat on and thinking about Essex and Oxfordshire, we talk about the fact that we're now being challenged to make very radical policy changes, radical changes the way we think and the way we work. That's equally true in central government. We have been lent on very heavily by ministers to do things differently, to remove restrictions, to ease legislation, to make it easier for authorities to do things, to think about some of the things we were thinking about in the future, such as micromobility and e-scooters, to allow them to happen much more quickly. Every local authority in England received a letter this week from the DfT outlining the things that we would like to see local authorities do, and I'm sure my other speakers have seen that letter by now, which basically precede what was said in Parliament and the things we've been talking about reallocating road space, easing restrictions, looking for hotspots and dealing with them, all these type of issues. And in the background, we're now looking at how we can ease the legislation around traffic regulation orders and some other areas of legislation to make it quicker for local government to be able to implement these changes. Now, this is radical stuff. This again is government fundamentally looking at the way it's done things for years and saying, why does it have to be like that? Are there quicker, faster, more efficient ways of doing things? So we are equally challenged by our political masters as local authorities are to try and not make the best of this, that's not quite the way to put it, but to try to understand what impetus this can give us to do things that maybe we should have been thinking about for a long while. And again, I think a lot of that are things that we won't unwind at the end of this. You know, I hope the TRO process becomes simpler and remains simpler. I hope the way that government thinks about the data that local authorities can provide to make central decisions continues to involve more local authority data. I really hope that. And there's a whole range of things where I hope that happens. And I think through bodies like ITS UK, there is a real opportunity for discourse there. Government really is now listening. You know, we are pioneering our way through this like local authorities are. And we are looking for suggestions and input and collaboration. So I think there is an opportunity for ITS UK and others to be central to how we have that more open discourse between local and central government.
Do you know what? We're completely out of time, and I think we've only just scratched the surface. So I'm going to go around very quickly to each of you to ask you what's keeping you awake at night? Because I think each of you might have different answers. And I think between us, we can start to build up a list that every local authority needs to consider. And for example, the difference between the county and the city or district or borough councils is a very interesting thing that we need to consider going forward when it comes to transport policy and how they work together, that I hadn't picked up until Llewellyn mentioned it. But I think what this is going to lead to is a series of more webinars where we get as many local authorities on as possible, and ITS UK will lead those. So this has kind of scratched the surface and set the scene at the beginning of a series that we will do of live webinars where we can get people asking questions and all chipping in and start to build the things to do list between us. But just quickly, Liz and Llewellyn, what are the things that are most worrying you, and what are the things that you think we need to really be considering as a matter of urgency as we try and move on over the next few weeks as some of the restrictions are relaxed?
If I go first then, Paul, I'm going to be cheeky and have two bites of the cherry. I 100% agree, and I've noted on my notebook here, partnerships, I think is a key thing. It doesn't worry me, but I think partnerships is a really big challenge that we've got. Just conversations we've had in Essex about how we're going to make these changes to the town centres. You suddenly realise that you're working with town centres, you're working with chambers of commerce. Everybody has a need and a requirement, and we have to work in partnerships to work our way through this. We can't have the highway authority in effect taking the responsibility for everything or being looked at for all the solutions. We've got to work in partnerships. And the other thing I would just add, as probably the thing that is more of a worry to me, is mental health. And I know it's Mental Health Week next week. And working from home is great. And I'm very fortunate. I never used to work from home. I'm enjoying working from home. But I'm in a bit like you, Paul, I'm in a household with 2 or 3 other people. So I have communication, I have contact. We have a number of people in our service within Essex who are on their own, living in a small flat, working from home. And whilst you can do these sorts of things that are great to give you some communication and some contact, it's not the same as seeing real people and being in office. So I think that's a really key message that we mustn't forget, is the mental health of our workers and how we support them through any changes we have, because it's not, we can't all work from home successfully and comfortably. We've got to look at that balance for people.
I think it's about embedding big changes into the way we do things, so the positive changes out of this. If you look at Holland, most people cite the oil crisis of the 70s as one of the sort of final straws that broke the camel's back of the changes towards becoming a cycling country, alongside a lot of public demonstration as well. So there's obviously clearly public support, but it's a thing that changed the country fundamentally, and why we look at it is somewhere we think that delivers best practice. So I think we've got to do that. We haven't done that in this country since the war, I don't think. We've had big periods of change. I'm not sure we've made things better out the end of them. And what we can do from our mistakes in the past is learn from them. And what we did do really badly through numerous governments is completely ignore communities and place. And that is why we still have massive problems in the valleys in Wales and in the Midlands, the coal mining areas and the industrial areas, because we didn't really think about people and what they wanted and how we build things better to maintain a community. And the one thing this has done is strengthen a community. So that, I think we've got, whatever we do, we have to somehow take hold of that, hopefully build the community back stronger and use intelligent interventions that support a place. And so that's where we've got to look at place-based budgeting much more. I really think that sometimes if you went and asked people and said, do you want to make my town centre better or build a road so it means I can go to work 1 minute quicker? I think I know what they'll say. They want a better town centre, they want a better place where they live. They can put up with an extra minute on their journey. Our priorities are wrong. Now ITS comes into that because we quite often provide the data to inform those decisions and where things can go and where things maybe we don't need to invest. What we do need is better data to inform those intelligence decisions that hopefully reinforce a strong community. and we have a big fundamental change. That's my hope. We're not New Zealand though, so we'll keep fighting from the bottom.
Right, I'm going to finish off just quickly with Darren, because of course at the moment, Darren, there's an expectation that central government will fund all the things that need to be done to get us through this crisis. But of course, as you've discovered in working for central government, governments don't have any money. They only have what the public give them, and the public can only give them the money that the economy allows them to give. And so it is imperative that our economy gets up and running and gets going again as soon as we possibly can. And so transport is going to be one of the key ways that we can help the economy get going again. So there is a lot of pressure on us.
I think so. I think, as we've seen, government will support services and will support authorities in the short term. It has to. And I think at the moment we are very much in that phase of doing that, and that can't last forever. And I think going back to York with my, my pretty two concerns with my York hat on, and this is kind of a national thing as well, is how will we support that transition back into some kind of normal activity? How will we ensure that working in a city that's very, very focused on the leisure market, how will we ensure that visitors can come back safely? How will we ensure that the thousands of jobs in the city that rely on pubs and bars and restaurants and attractions are able to restart again? Because as a city, we can't expect the government to continue to fund that forever. The furlough scheme won't last forever. The levels of support we're getting won't last forever. And as a highway authority, my concern would be how we meet those aims and do it safely and allow people to get back to work again. And I think there are some short-term and long-term decisions in that about how we use as Liz was saying, about how we think about the varying uses that we need to put the city to, and the varying interests in that. That would be keeping me awake at the moment. In the longer term, my nightmares would probably be more about long-term sustainability of funding. And I think that for most cities, that the revenue funding that we get from the services we provide will fundamentally change. The way that parking is used, the way that public transport is used, the way that things like park and ride generate an income or don't will change. That would worry me. Capital investment would also worry me. The benefit cost ratios of schemes that we intend to build, which are very much built around a pre-coronavirus model of transport and travel, will change. The whole way that we think about local planning, the whole way that we think about new development, about commuting, about where new housing goes, about where major infrastructure to support development goes and what that looks like, will change in ways that we currently don't see and we currently don't understand. And I think that would be worrying me. And I think that's the thing I would really be in the long term looking for support from government for, is to start to understand what the new normal will be like and how we need to plan for that.
Okay, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but I think one of the takeaways here is we can't beat around the bush. These are worrying, difficult and hard times, but what we can't do is stick our head in the sand, pretend it isn't happening, put it in the too difficult pile, or just hope everything will get better. So what we need to do is share our experiences, share our ideas and our solutions as much as possible. So we'll have a series of webinars where ITS UK will lead the discussion on, as I say, the future of how we can deliver transport as best we can and deliver it as safely and as healthily as we can. And we'll have those series of webinars, but this has really set the scene for us. So thank you very much to Liz Burr, to Llewellyn Morgan and to Darren Capes for your time today. Thank you for watching, and keep your eye out for future ITS UK webinars on this vital subject. And we'll have more of our roundtable discussion style ones like this on the coronavirus crisis in the weeks to come. Thank you very much for watching.